Rise of the European Emperor by Taishan Laonyo.
Chapter 261 Performance. After receiving the task from Bonnets, Sivag looked very unhappy. He was also aware of the character of his men. After several battles, those who survived were not elite warriors, but escape experts. However, because he was dependent on others, he couldn't refuse. Besides, if the show of weakness was successful, there was indeed a possibility of victory. In desperation, Sivag had to take 3,000 escape experts to the eastern region to provoke. After arriving in the eastern region of West Frisia, Sivag took his men and performed his true colors. These escape experts cherished their lives very much in battle. Even when attacking a small town, everyone rushed to fall behind. Yes, scrambled to fall behind. As for the people who rushed to the front, they were all unlucky guys pushed out by everyone. Because they cherished their lives, when fighting with the militia in some small towns, those West Frisian resistance soldiers did not put in much effort. It often takes a long time for 3,000 people to fight dozens of people. Moreover, most of the defeated militiamen were frightened by the momentum of the 3,000 escape experts. After they retreated, the escape experts began to chase them vigorously. This kind of dog-chasing chicken situation is the favorite of the West Frisian resistance soldiers. Because the enemy is busy escaping, not fighting desperately, causing the least casualties to them. After several battles, although some towns were captured and a lot of money and food were seized, the efficiency was not high. The scouts sent by the Saxons also hid in the dark and observed the poor performance of the West Frisian resistance. In fact, Sivag also studied on Texel Island for a period of time and knew the importance of military discipline. If a strict order was really issued to force them, the performance of the remaining West Frisian resistance would not be so bad. However, this time, he came to show weakness. Therefore, he did not care about those men who were busy saving their lives, and even encouraged them. Under Sivag's connivance, those escape experts were busy competing with each other, and looked even weaker. The Saxon scout reported the poor performance of the West Frisian resistance to General Huss, the Saxon garrison commander of Groningen, and suggested that the Saxon army attack and destroy this army. However, General Huss was very cautious. He was not worried that Sivag's army was hiding its strength, but that the East Frisian state would stab him in the back when he attacked. After repeated thinking, Huss finally made a decision. He sent the only 500 heavy cavalry in Groningen to attack Sivag's 3,000 escape experts. The main force of the Saxon army still defended Groningen. Then, 500 heavy armored knights, with a group of conscripts, left the city. Unexpectedly, although Sivag showed weakness, he did a good job in reconnaissance. During the time when he was a prisoner of Marin, he learned to scout carefully. Therefore, along the way, his reconnaissance cavalry spread far away. After the 500 heavy cavalrymen from Groningen left the city, Sivag's scout cavalry soon discovered them and hurriedly reported. The marching speed of heavy cavalry is very slow, not much faster than infantry. But the scout cavalrymen are all light cavalry and fast. Therefore, Sivag received the news of the enemy's heavy cavalry attack early. Then, in order to play a full set of plays, he deliberately put the battlefield outside a small town with relatively complete defense facilities. And inside the town, he also sent people to prepare. For example, the roads connecting to the outside world were blocked, leaving only one exit. Sivag deliberately pretended not to know the appearance of the enemy, pulled the team out of the town, and encountered the 500 Saxon heavy cavalry very close to the town. Then, Sivag didn't even fight, but took the lead in fleeing and fled to the town. His 3,000 escape experts were not to be outdone. Although they were infantrymen, they were all loose young and bolt when they fled. Although the horses of the 500 Saxon heavy cavalry accelerated, they had no way to deal with the enemy who was escaping so quickly. Except for one unlucky guy who sprained his foot while escaping and was unfortunately trampled to death by the horses of the Saxon heavy cavalry, everyone else successfully escaped back to the town and blocked the only exit of the town with stones. The heavy cavalry could not be used in places with complex terrain, and the horses were exhausted from the previous charge, and the knights themselves were tired. In desperation, the Saxon knights had to dismount and surround the town. Because the horses were not suitable for charging, the Saxon knights simply wore full sets of plate armor, held two-handed swords, and began to attack on foot after a good rest. However, the wretched Sivag scattered stones, bricks and other debris on all the roads in the town. After the plate armor knights rushed into the town, they found that they could not rush up. Because, they were not on flat ground, but on a destroyed street with many obstacles. At this time, Sivag took out the nemesis of the plate knights, the arquebus. Although Sivag did not bring many arquebus, he still had 20 of them. As a result, more than a dozen Saxon plate knights who rushed in were injured. In desperation, the Saxon knights had to withdraw from the town with their injured companions. The next morning, the knights were well fed and ready to attack again, but after rushing in, they were stunned to find that the town was empty. It turned out that Sivag and his men had fled in the middle of the night. Heavy cavalry was not suitable for chasing the fleeing enemy, so in desperation, the Saxon knights had to withdraw to Groningen in dismay. When General Huss heard about this situation, he felt a little incredible. Did they lose the battle on purpose? General Huss did not believe the failure of Sivag's West Frisian resistance. Because the other side did not suffer any losses and could completely defend the town. However, the enemy escaped, which made Huss suspect that the enemy deliberately escaped to attract his men to chase. The more Huss thought about it, the more he felt that this was possible, so he sent out 100 auxiliary cavalry, that is, light cavalry, to investigate and see if the enemy really withdrew. In addition, it was mainly necessary to observe the enemy's behavior during the retreat. Huss was not a bad commander. He knew that if the enemy retreated in an orderly manner, it might be a trap, and if it retreated in a noisy manner with a chaotic pace, it should be a real rout. The light cavalry sent out soon brought back the news that the enemy fled in a disorderly manner. Moreover, when they were running away, they looked panicked as if there were jackals and tigers chasing them from behind. How could they know that when Marin gave advice to Charles II, he had already designed this kind of hasty escape plot? Before setting off, Sivag had practiced this kind of disorderly escape plot with his 3,000 escape experts. When Sivag received the information that the other side had sent light cavalry to observe, he began to give orders for everyone to run away. Of course, he still had 200 elite soldiers with him. If those light cavalry dared to chase and kill, they could handle it. Therefore, when everyone was performing the escape, they were relatively scattered in the periphery, but in the core area, Sivag was ready to fight at any time with 200 elite soldiers. Fortunately, the Saxon light cavalry did not attack rashly, but went back directly to report the news. Thus, the report that the West Frisian resistance army was about to collapse and the entire army was fleeing in panic was delivered to Huss. Then, it was delivered to George in the Duchy of Saxony. Chapter 262, I promise not to send out troops. By the way, Duke George of Saxony, after receiving the news that the West Frisian resistance army had revived again, had taken certain countermeasures early. For example, he summoned troops and re-entered West Frisia. In addition, he sent people to ask Emperor Maximilian I for help. Yes, he asked Maximilian I for help. However, he did not ask Maximilian I to send troops, but asked Maximilian I to help greet Marin and try to prevent Marin from participating in the war. Through reconnaissance and analysis, the Duchy of Saxony already knew that it was the Duchy of Guedes that supported the West Frisian resistance army behind the scenes. What relieved George was that it seemed that Marin did not directly participate in it. If Marin participated directly, George would have no confidence in winning. Duke George of Saxony hated Charles II, the Duke of Guedes, who was making trouble. At the same time, George did not look down on the Duchy of Guedes, believing that the Duchy of Guedes could not compete with the powerful Duchy of Saxony. Because he didn't know that the Duchy of Guedes had been preparing for several years in secret, and with the secret help of France, the Swiss were brought in to help. The only thing Duke George was worried about now was Marin and his East Frisian army. After all, if George sent troops, Groningen would be empty, and if East Frisian took the opportunity to attack, George would be defeated. Moreover, the strength of the East Frisian army had already left a shadow in Duke George's heart. Moreover, at the last imperial parliament, on the issue of whether to recognize Marin as the Duke of Schleswig, he voted against it along with his cousin, the Elector of Saxony, Frederick III. Therefore, Duke George was very worried that Marin would hate him for this and choose to attack West Frisia with the Duchy of Guedes. Therefore, when Duke George learned that the West Frisian resistance army supported by the Duchy of Guedes had revived again, his first reaction was not how to suppress it, but how to prevent Marin from participating in the war. The only person who is suitable to be a middleman and can make Marin listen is probably his uncle Maximilian I. His father, Duke Albrecht, is the cousin of Maximilian I, and he is naturally the cousin of Maximilian I. In addition, Marin is considered to be on the side of the emperor, so it is more appropriate to ask Maximilian I to be a middleman. On the day of receiving the urgent report from West Frisia, Duke George of Saxony sent a messenger to Austria to seek the support and reconciliation of Emperor Maximilian I. After receiving George's request for help, Maximilian I thought about it again and agreed to Duke George's request. Because, although Duke George is not as influential as Frederick III, he also has his own power among the Saxon nobles. Once they are on the imperial parliament, their votes are not small. Moreover, as far as Maximilian I knows, Marin is now busy occupying the bishopric of Munster, and basically has no time to care about other things. Therefore, he sent an envoy to Dresden, the capital of the Duchy of Saxony, and then followed George's foreign minister to the capital of the Bishop of Munster, Munster City, to negotiate with Marin, in order to get Marin not to send troops to participate in the war in West Frisia. Even though George received the good news that the West Frisian resistance is vulnerable, he did not dare to act rashly. After all, the attitude of East Frisia is still unknown. What? Duke George hopes that I will not send troops to participate in the war in West Frisia. After learning the intention of Saxon Foreign Minister Bull, Marin was stunned, but quickly reacted. It seems that George is not stupid. If East Frisia sends troops and attacks from the east and west with the Guides army, the defeat of the Duchy of Saxony is basically a foregone conclusion. So, if George does not come to ask him, it proves that George's IQ should be negative. Yes, Lord George hopes that Duke Marin can stay out of it and not send troops to participate in the war in West Frisia. In addition, this Knight Heisen is the envoy of His Majesty the Emperor, and he brought His Majesty's letter. Marin knew Heisen, who was one of the knights of Maximilian I's guards and had dealt with Marin before. Knight Heisen took out Maximilian I's handwritten letter and handed it to Marin with both hands. Marin took a look and found that Maximilian I asked him in a very polite tone not to get involved in this dispute. After all, Marin is no longer the little baron he was at the beginning, and he is not even a count, but a duke. Therefore, even Emperor Maximilian I needs to be polite to Marin and can no longer boss him around. In fact, Duke George and Maximilian I didn't know that Marin didn't intend to wade into this muddy water at all. However, necessary bargaining is still needed. So, Marin turned his face and said to Bull, I remember that at the last imperial conference, Duke George voted against the question of whether to recognize me as the Duke of Schleswig, right? Now I want you not to interfere in the affairs of West Frisia. What was he doing in the first place? This. Lord George also wanted to support you last time. But, you know, Lord Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, is Lord George's cousin. It was him who forced Lord George to vote against it. Bull was also quick-witted and directly put the blame on Frederick III, the Elector of Saxony. Moreover, it seemed very reasonable. You can choose not to send troops, but what about Duke George's sincerity? What is he willing to pay? Marin obviously wanted to get some benefits and was unwilling to agree for nothing. This. Lord Marin, do you have any good suggestions? Bull was also a bachelor, and he directly threw the pot to Marin. Marin thought about it and put forward his own request. Don't worry, I won't blackmail your Duke George. I only have 3 conditions. Please speak. Bull took out a parchment notebook and began to record. These 3 conditions. First, I need Duke George to recognize my legal right to rule the bishopric of Munster. No problem. Bull agreed directly. The Pope has agreed, how dare Duke George say no? Be careful of being excommunicated. Second, if one day Duke George wants to sell West Frisia, he must give priority to me, and the price shall not exceed 1 million gold coins. Unless I don't buy it, I can sell it to others. Sell West Frisia. Bull was a little confused. Lord George has never had such an idea. Marin smiled and thought to himself, George must not have that idea now. When he was beaten by the Principality of Guides and couldn't take care of himself, he knew that there was no hope of recovery, so of course he wanted to sell it and recover some costs. However, he would not tell Bull about the future. So, he said domineeringly, why are you talking so much nonsense? If Duke George doesn't want to sell, I won't force him to sell. I mean if. Bull thought about it and didn't think Duke George would sell the territory. However, he still cautiously stated that he would ask Duke George for instructions. The third point is that I hope Duke George will not participate in the alliance organized by the electorate of Saxony and Denmark to retaliate against me. If he joins, according to this clause, the ownership of West Frisia will automatically belong to me. Marin had a hunch that Denmark and the electorate of Saxony would definitely not give up. The Danish revenge is a matter of time. Therefore, it is necessary for him to give Duke George a shot of prevention. And if the electorate of Saxony forms an alliance to deal with him, it is almost inevitable to win over Duke George to join. This. Bull was a little embarrassed. What? The Duchy of Saxony still wants to attack me? With this idea, you dare to ask me not to send troops to West Frisia? In this case, I will send troops to West Frisia and the West Frisian Resistance Army to attack from the east and west. No, I just feel that I can't make the decision on this matter. Is it still necessary to think about it? With this clause, when the Elector of Saxony wants to win you over to attack me in the future, you will have an excuse not to send troops. In this way, many people will be saved. Bull nodded, and seemed to agree with Marin. Then he asked, Lord Marin, you put forward these 3 conditions, so, what about you? Myself? As long as you agree to these 3 conditions, I promise not to send troops to West Frisia. In addition, the reinforcements of the Duchy of Saxony will be allowed to pass through safely. Promise to send troops? Absolutely not. If I send troops, I will automatically give up the bishopric of Munster. This clause can be written into the peace treaty. Marin said firmly. That's great. I'll go back and ask Lord George. I think these 3 points are not too much, and Lord George should agree. After saying that, Bull went back happily. Marin laughed. He couldn't help playing word games again. It's true that he promised not to send troops, but it doesn't mean he won't get involved. Supporting the Principality of Guedes with money, food and weapons is not considered sending troops. If George hadn't failed, how could he be desperate? If he wasn't desperate, how could he sell West Frisia? With the preemptive purchase clause, he can pay to buy West Frisia. Chapter 263, The Danish King's Conspiracy. In the royal palace in Copenhagen, Denmark, King Hans of Denmark was entertaining Frederick III, Elector of Saxony, and Joachim I, Elector of Brandenburg. Perhaps because he had something to discuss, Hans sent everyone away. After 3 rounds of drinks, King Hans put down his glass and said with a sad face, Alas, I never thought that I, the King of Denmark and the leader of the Kalmar Union, would end up in such a situation. Joachim I did not speak. He was a junior, and some things were difficult to say. Frederick III comforted him, Brother-in-law, don't worry. You still have 2 great powers, Denmark and Norway, and your strength can still be restored. Restore? King Hans smiled bitterly and said, Under normal circumstances, it would certainly not be difficult to restore. But, Frederick, do you know? Lübeck and Hamburg, these 2 bastards, control the Øresund Strait. As long as they find Danish merchant ships, they will be confiscated immediately. They do this because they are afraid that I will rise again. Now, I want to do some business, and I need to recruit some British sailors and disguise them as British merchant ships to transport goods to the Baltic Sea. When crossing the Øresund Strait, I will be taxed by Lübeck and Hamburg. So excessive? Frederick III and Joachim I were both very surprised. Lübeck and Hamburg's move was too vicious. Like the Hanseatic League, Denmark's economy mainly relies on trade, and it is maritime trade. Before, Denmark's Kalmar League's trade volume in the Baltic Sea was not less than that of the Hanseatic League. Moreover, because it occupies the Øresund Strait, it has an advantage over the Hanseatic League. But now, Lübeck and Hamburg are so overbearing that they don't allow Danish merchant ships to pass through the Øresund Strait. This is simply a death sentence for Denmark. Without maritime trade, can Denmark recover? Frederick III and Joachim I were both silent. Yes, Lübeck and Hamburg are forcing Denmark to a dead end. If the situation continues, Denmark will fall from a first-class power to a second- or third-rate country in less than 20 years. Now, do you know what I'm doing? I'm organizing all the citizens to reclaim wasteland and plant crops. There's no way to make money from maritime trade, so I can only take the citizens to reclaim wasteland and transform Denmark into an agricultural country. King Hans shook his head in distress, his face full of despair. In the past, the Danes disdained to engage in agriculture because of the huge profits from maritime trade. If there was a shortage of food, they would just use money to buy it. However, now that Denmark has no merchant ships, Denmark's economy can only rely on agriculture and fisheries. Moreover, the fishing boats were afraid of being detained by the Hanseatic League, so they dared not take the Øresund Channel. Instead, they took the waterway between the islands west of Zealand. However, this waterway was not easy to take. There were many islands and reefs. It was easy to run aground and sink if they took this route. Fortunately, King Hans had a good relationship with England. Henry VII saw that he was pitiful and sold him 20 merchant ships and provided British sailors. In this way, King Hans could continue to rely on these 20 British ships to make a certain profit and maintain expenses. Otherwise, the Danish court might be paralyzed due to lack of funds. So, Hans, how can we help you? The young Joachim I said impatiently. Europeans often call their father-in-law by his name. Frederick III did not speak, but fell into deep thought. He felt that this matter was extremely difficult. Hans drank a glass of wine in one gulp, took a breath, and said, For the past 6 months, I have been thinking about why I failed. Finally, I figured it out. Oh, why? Frederick III was also interested. Because we, Denmark, do not have a strong army. Frederick III and Joachim I were a little confused. Is this the reason? Yes, that's the reason. King Hans of Denmark said solemnly. 3 months ago, a Danish businessman who had been to Portugal told me such an interesting story. Spain and Portugal are neighboring countries on the Iberian Peninsula, and both are very powerful. However, Portugal is strong at sea. They have a huge naval fleet that is no weaker than Denmark's, and are the overlord of the Atlantic. And Spain, although its maritime power is also good, its maritime power is much weaker than Portugal, and its main maritime power is in the Mediterranean. Originally, Spain and Portugal agreed to divide the earth into the eastern and western halves. Spain got the western half, and Portugal got the eastern half. But a few years ago, the Spanish got a nautical chart, so they sent Columbus to India before the Portuguese, and brought back a lot of spices. Then, the Spaniards made a fortune. Afterwards, the Portuguese were very angry, believing that the Spanish had violated the original agreement and harmed the interests of Portugal. So, the Portuguese threatened to wipe out the Spanish maritime forces. But the Spaniards don't care. The Spanish royal couple warned the Portuguese that if they dared to move the Spanish fleet, then Spain would gather a large army from the land, surround Lisbon, break into the city and capture all the Portuguese nobles, including their king. I understand. Frederick III's eyes lit up. The Spaniards used their strengths to attack Portugal's weaknesses and forced Portugal to compromise. Frederick III said excitedly. Yes, I think so too. In the past, Denmark was a naval power. When the navy existed, no one could threaten Copenhagen. But once the fleet was destroyed, Denmark would be like a lamb to be slaughtered, and let the 4 enemies slaughter it. Because the Danish army is too weak and too small. Then, brother-in-law, what are you going to do? Frederick III asked, staring at Hans with great interest. It's very simple. Denmark's navy has been destroyed and its development is restricted. Then, I can only develop the army. Because they don't restrict Denmark from developing the army. Then what? Asked Joachim I. After I develop an extremely large army, I plan to rely on decisive battles on land to retaliate against my enemies. Of course, I also need your cooperation. I hope you can organize as many troops as possible to help me defeat my enemies in one battle. How to do it specifically? Frederick III frowned. He wanted to listen to Hans' strategy to see if it was feasible before deciding whether to send troops to help. Specifically, I have thought about it. As you all know, Lübeck and Hamburg are both maritime countries, and their armies are worse than Denmark's. Frederick III and Joachim I nodded, agreeing with Hans's statement. I plan to form a strong army and quickly move south from the Jutland Peninsula. With the cooperation of your army, we will first break through the city of Lübeck and seize Lübeck's property and ships. Then, send troops to surround the city of Hamburg and wait for the arrival of Marin's army. Finally, we will fight a decisive battle under the city of Hamburg and destroy Marin's army. Then, take the opportunity to attack his old nest, East Frisia, break through Auric, and force Marin, the bastard, to sign a surrender treaty. Well, it's a good plan. But, brother-in-law, how can you ensure that your Danish army can defeat Marin's army? As far as I know, his army is very strong. Frederick III asked seriously. I have thought about this. Denmark's army is indeed weak. Therefore, I plan to introduce Swiss mercenaries. Swiss mercenaries? It's indeed a good choice. Frederick thought about it and nodded. Joachim I also agreed with Hans's idea. So far, the Swiss mercenaries and Marin's army have not had a head-on confrontation. The Swiss were not the main force when the Spaniards and the French fought. On the contrary, the main force was the Italian mercenaries. Many people believe that the Swiss mercenaries were actually implicated by the Italian mercenaries who were not good at fighting in the confrontation with the Spaniards. After the war, in order to maintain their reputation, the Swiss kept claiming that it was the Italian fleeing soldiers who attacked the Swiss mercenaries' battle formation and disrupted the Swiss mercenaries' formation, which led to their defeat. Most Europeans believe this explanation of the Swiss. After all, the Swiss and their glorious reputation and glorious record are there. Therefore, until now, no one thinks that Marin's army is stronger than the Swiss. At most, it is closer to the fighting power of the Swiss. King Hans plans to hire 20,000 Swiss mercenaries to fight Marin to the death. At the same time, Hans plans to recruit 20,000 Danish youths starting this year and invite Swiss instructors to train them day and night during the slack season. After the spring plowing next year, King Hans will dispatch 20,000 Swiss mercenaries and 20,000 local troops trained by the Swiss to join the armies of the Electorate of Saxony and the Electorate of Brandenburg to launch an attack together, vowing to destroy Lübeck and Hamburg, as well as the country of Marin. Frederick III and Joachim I agreed with Hans' plan very much. For this reason, the two decided to each send 15,000 veterans to make up 30,000 people, join the 40,000 Danish troops, a total of 70,000 troops, and jointly eliminate the armies of Lübeck, Hamburg and Marin. The most important thing is to destroy Marin's army. Because, according to intelligence, Marin now has 30,000 main forces. Which is not easy to mess with. As for Sweden, it can be eliminated last, since Sweden is not a big deal anyway. However, no matter how strong Marin's army is, King Hans, Frederick III and Joachim, I do not think that Marin can win against the 70,000 coalition forces of the three families. In particular, there are 20,000 Swiss mercenaries whose combat effectiveness exceeds that of Marin's army as the main combat force. As long as he wins, King Hans promises that he will only take back the Duchy of Schleswig and the Duchy of Holstein, rescue his cousin's family who are under house arrest, and liberate the county of Oldenburg. As for Marin's land, such as the county of East Frisia, the bishopric of Munster, and the bishopric of Osnabrück, they are all divided by Frederick III and Joachim I. As for Marin, King Hans plans to imprison him and lock him up in the basement of the Copenhagen Palace for life. When he has nothing to do, he will whip him a few times. Chapter 264, The Angry Henry VII. On the island of Ireland, after several months of hard work, Earl Edward has successfully taken control of the Pale, the county of Kildare and the MacMorrough dynasty of the Kingdom of Leinster. As for the part of the land that the McCarthy dynasty was allocated, Earl Edward gave it to Earl Desmond Morris to gain his support. After all, Earl Edward's ultimate goal is England, not Ireland. Now, the territories owned by Earl Edward are mainly the Pale, the county of Kildare, the land of the MacMorrough dynasty of the Kingdom of Leinster and the city of Cork. In the spring, Earl Edward presided over the Irish serfs to carry out large-scale spring ploughing in order to obtain enough food in the fall. After all, relying on the outside world to provide food is not very reliable. The Pale and the county of Kildare on the island of Ireland are peat-rich areas on the island of Ireland. The land here is also the most fertile. In addition, it is located in the precipitation shadow area, in the east of the island of Ireland. There is not as much rain as on the west coast, which is very suitable for the development of agriculture. Although no fertilizer was used, the peat land was fertile soil rich in impurities, and the agricultural output has always been relatively high. Otherwise, the British would not have chosen this piece of land on the east side of the island of Ireland as the direct territory of the British king. Earl Edward attached great importance to the spring ploughing of the direct territory of the British king and the county of Kildare. As long as the grain harvest here is good, he can gradually get rid of his dependence on foreign countries. There are more than 80,000 British semi-fine wool sheep. Earl Edward was reluctant to sell 10,000 of them to the North Sea Chamber of Commerce. However, he also knew that his strength was not enough to compete with the British and needed everyone's support. Moreover, the North Sea Chamber of Commerce was also very generous and sent 2,800 experienced German mercenaries to help him guard Dublin. More importantly, these 2,800 German mercenaries had no political demands and would not force Earl Edward to do something he didn't want to do. For example, the French had forced Earl Edward to attack the British Calais fortress before. If that were the case, Earl Edward would hardly succeed and would not benefit from it. With these 2,800 German mercenaries, Earl Edward can use them to compete with the French and avoid being too controlled by the French. Moreover, the North Sea Chamber of Commerce not only sent 2,800 German mercenaries, but also transported a large amount of food to supply the army. After all, once the British come, the defense of Dublin will definitely be a long-term battle. At that time, enough food will be needed. Therefore, it is absolutely very important for the North Sea Chamber of Commerce to send a large amount of rye. In addition to these, the North Sea Chamber of Commerce also transported 4 large iron doors by large ships to guard against possible bombardment by the British Army. Although the British artillery equipment rate is not high, the blacksmiths in Essex County are trying to cast cannons with wrought iron. However, the best of them, Old John, has been hired by Marin. Then, if you want to cast an excellent iron cannon, red cannon, it is estimated that it will take some time. Although there are some copper cannons in Britain, they are all small caliber cannons and are not suitable for smashing city gates. This is mainly because Britain is not short of iron, but it is very short of copper. The price of copper is so expensive, so the possibility of equipping a large number of artillery is naturally low. When the sun was shining in the spring, Henry VII suddenly remembered his direct territory of the King of England on the island of Ireland. The black soil, peat land, seems to be very fertile and the grain yield is quite high. So, on a whim, Henry VII decided to send his Minister of Agriculture Stephenson to the direct territory of the King of England in the east of the island of Ireland by boat to inspect the spring ploughing situation. Stephenson naturally received the order and set off with 3 ships. Unexpectedly, when he sailed to the waters near Ireland, Stevenson's fleet was besieged by dozens of French warships. Fortunately, Stevenson had been in the navy before, and seeing that the situation was not right, he decisively let 2 escort ships with thousands of ships stop the French ship. And he himself fled on the main ship. In this way, Henry VII received the bad news that the eastern waters of the island of Ireland were blocked by the French fleet. So he called in the ministers to discuss countermeasures. "Your Majesty, according to Lord Stevenson, the French have dozens of warships. And we in England have more than 100 warships. So why don't we gather all the warships and defeat the French fleet in one fell swoop?" Admiral Johnson said confidently. In this era, Britain was not a maritime power. It was already the limit to be able to gather more than 100 warships. Moreover, there were no cannons on the ships, and the old tactic of jumping off the ship to help chop was still popular. Of course, France was not a maritime power either, and its maritime power was even weaker than that of Britain. After all, France has always been a country that values the European continent and despises the ocean. Therefore, when the navies of the two countries were compared, the British still had enough confidence. At the same time, the British fleet was not all directly under the King of England. More than half of them were ships and sailors drawn by the King of England from the Five Ports Alliance. The so-called Five Ports Alliance was an alliance between the 5 English Channel port cities of Dover, Hastings, New Romney, Hythe and Sandwich to protect the navigation safety of the English Channel. This alliance enjoys various privileges granted by the British royal family. However, when the King of England needs it, they also need to dispatch ships and sailors to help the King of England fight. Even in this era, the main force of the British fleet came from the Five Ports Alliance. Henry VII followed Johnson's advice and mobilized hundreds of 200-ton warships from the Five Ports Alliance and various places to take the initiative to attack the French fleet that blocked the coast of Ireland. When the French fleet saw that the situation was not good, it did not fight the British fleet, but turned around and ran away. But before running away, the commander of the French fleet was very righteous and put down a small boat, allowing the sailors on the boat to go ashore to warn Earl Edward. After all, the French fleet helped to block the coast of the island of Ireland, not to fight the British fleet, but to help block the news. Now, the British have even dispatched the main force of the fleet. That shows that the British have found something wrong. At this time, blocking the news has lost its meaning. Therefore, the French fleet directly evacuated the coast of Ireland and returned to France. Only a small boat was left to inform Earl Edward and the Scottish fleet that blockaded the northern half of the eastern coast of Ireland. After driving away the French fleet, the British fleet sent people to land in the coastal area of the MacMorrough Kingdom of the Kingdom of Leinster and captured a local minor official to torture him for information. As a result, the local minor official told the British fleet that Earl Edward had occupied the MacMorrough Kingdom and Dublin in the north a few months ago. Moreover, the other side seemed to have 8,000 troops. Edward did have 8,000 people when he occupied the MacMorrough Kingdom. Robin, the commander of the British fleet, felt the seriousness of the situation and immediately withdrew to England and reported the news to Henry VII. When Henry VII heard that Edward of the House of York was not only still alive, but also occupied a large area of territory on the island of Ireland with an army of 8,000 and controlled Dublin, he was furious. Idiots, they are all a bunch of idiots. Did Earl Kildare grow up eating shit? It's okay that he can't beat him, but he couldn't even send any news. Damn it, a few months have passed, and that bastard Edward must have established a foothold on the island of Ireland. Come, come. I want to call a royal meeting. Go and invite all the ministers. Quick. Henry VII yelled hysterically, his voice full of anger. Chapter 265, England sends troops. Soon, the trusted ministers of the title Henry VII were summoned. They were Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derbyshire, John de Wheeler, Earl of Oxford, and Henry Percy, the 5th Earl of Northumberland. As well as Sir Richard Pole, Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester, Baron John Deangham, Thomas Howard, the 2nd Duke of Norfolk, and Johnson, the Minister of the Navy. Among them, the first 3 were nobles who helped Henry VII ascend the throne and had the merit of supporting him. For example, Thomas Stanley, Earl of Derbyshire, was actually the stepfather of Henry VII. When Henry VII launched an army to attack the previous King Richard III, it was Thomas Stanley who secretly contacted John de Wheeler, Earl of Oxford, and Henry the Elder, the 4th Earl of Northumberland, deceased, and together they pulled Richard III's legs, kept his troops in place, and sent his younger brother William Stanley with 3,000 people to defect in the battle. This enabled Henry VII to win the Battle of Bosworth in a thrilling manner and become the King of England despite not having an advantage in military strength. Therefore, Henry VII treated these 3 nobles very well. Thomas Stanley was originally just a lord, and Henry VII canonized him as the first Earl of Derbyshire because of his great contributions. Although the titles of the Earls of Oxford and Northumberland were not improved, they received many fiefs and rewards. However, Henry VII respected these three meritorious nobles more. But the ones he specifically trusted were Sir Richard Pole, Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester, Baron John Dingham, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and Johnson, the Secretary of the Navy, who were more capable of governing. After all, Britain has now entered a peaceful stage, and war is no longer the theme. Construction is the theme. For example, Baron John Dingham and Duke Thomas Howard are masters of government affairs, serving as Prime Minister and Chancellor of the Exchequer respectively. And Richard Fox, Bishop of Winchester, is the Lord Chancellor of the Privy Seal. As for Sir Richard Pole and Johnson, they were confidants promoted by Henry VII from the lower nobles, and they helped Henry VII control the army. Moreover, Sir Richard Pole was the husband of Margaret of the House of York. And this Margaret was the sister of Earl Edward, the one who helped Earl Edward escape. Of course, Margaret of the House of York was more scheming, and she silenced the mouth, so the fact that she helped her brother escape was not exposed. Henry VII asked Richard Pole to marry Margaret of the House of York, which was also a promotion for his trusted subordinates. Because Margaret was a descendant of the royal family after all, and had the title of Countess of Salisbury. After Richard Pole and Margaret got married, their offspring could inherit the title of Earl. Johnson was not of high birth, just a baron. His family lacked fiefdoms, so they had to join the Five Ports Alliance and engage in maritime transportation. Therefore, Johnson had rich sailing experience and was selected by Henry VII as the Minister of the Navy. The nobles gathered together, not to hold a tea party, but to discuss the threat of Earl Edward on the island of Ireland. When Henry VII informed several ministers of the intelligence he had learned, everyone was shocked. Is the news reliable? Thomas Stanley, the highly respected Earl of Derby, looked seriously at Johnson, the Minister of the Navy. After all, the news was brought back by the Navy. Robin is a reliable person, I don't think he will lie. Edward of York. 8,000 troops. Where did he get so many troops? John de Villers, Earl of Oxford, was very surprised by the news. You know, when Henry VII landed in England to compete with Richard III for the throne, he only brought 2,000 French mercenaries. It was beyond imagination that Earl Edward had 8,000 troops. Of course, the current situation is different from that year. Richard III was very unpopular in Britain because he murdered his nephew Edward V and usurped the throne. Under such circumstances, Henry VII boldly landed with 2,000 French mercenaries and fought with Richard III. Because Henry VII knew that his stepfather Thomas Stanley secretly helped him win over many nobles. He not only had 2,000 troops, but also had the support of many nobles. But Edward, Earl of Warwick, was different. He was imprisoned for 14 years, which resulted in him not having much contact with people in the aristocratic circle. It was impossible to gain the support of the British aristocracy. In addition, under the rule of Henry VII, the political situation in Britain was stable, and no one was willing to break this stability. Therefore, although Earl Edward had 8,000 troops, he did not dare to attack the British mainland easily. After all, the lesson of the fake Richard was there. With the support of France and Scotland, the fake Richard wanted to learn from Henry VII and command the nobles. As a result, no one cared about him. He could only take thousands of troops and fight against Henry VII's army, and then was captured and killed. Edward, Earl of Warwick learned this lesson and did not dare to return to England with his troops easily. Instead, under the advice of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, he now took root in Ireland. Then, wait for the British army to attack. As long as the solid defense of Dublin is used, the British attack can be defeated. In that case, the British army will not only lose many soldiers, but also lose morale due to failure. At that time, it was time for Earl Edward to lead his troops back to England. Henry VII's ministers were obviously aware of the seriousness of the situation. They believed that Earl Edward of Warwick was much more cautious than the fake Richard and more difficult to deal with. After all, waiting for the enemy to land, then defeating the enemy with ease, and landing to besiege the enemy's city were very different in difficulty. However, although Earl Edward of Warwick refused to attack England, England had to attack Edward. According to the time calculation, Edward attacked Dublin probably after the King of England completed the grain collection of the King's direct territories in Ireland. Because, at that time, Dublin was still under the control of the King of England. In other words, Earl Edward occupied Dublin in the MacMorrough dynasty for only a few months. But the ministers present knew that once Earl Edward survived the autumn harvest and harvested another crop of grain, his strength would be even stronger. At the moment, Earl Edward must rely on the support of the French. But the support of the French must be limited. This kind of support from foreign countries is not unreserved. Because the French's goal was definitely to cause unrest in Britain, but not to support a new British king to crush the old king. Because it is in the interests of foreign countries for the throne pretenders and the throne holders to fight to the death. But Henry VII and his ministers did not know that although the support from France and Scotland was indeed limited, it was not enough to make Earl Edward strong. However, with the secret support of Marin, Earl Edward's strength was not much worse than Henry VII. In addition, Earl Edward was fighting to defend the city, which had a greater advantage. In the end, Henry VII's royal meeting decided to recruit troops from all over England and land on the island of Ireland to fight. In order to completely defeat Earl Edward, Henry VII decided to send 20,000 troops to eliminate Earl Edward in Dublin. In order to achieve this goal, Henry VII mobilized most of the royal army and noble army, and recruited 7,000 English longbowmen from all over England to besiege Dublin. The English longbowmen have a long range and great power, which is very suitable for killing the defenders on the top of the city. Chapter 266, Send some half-body armor to Edward. It would not take a few days for England to send troops. After all, England did not have a standing army in this era. Therefore, if you want to send troops, you must first gather all the troops. Although London has thousands of soldiers and horses, Henry VII cannot use this force. After all, London is the core area of England. If all the troops are sent out and the French army raids London, then Henry VII will be finished. Therefore, this time, Henry VII used the troops of nobles from all over the country and the 7,000 longbowmen. The longbowmen in England are a very special class. They are not nobles, but they enjoy certain privileges and belong to the warrior class between nobles and civilians. At present, muskets have just emerged. Except for Marin's army, the Spanish army and the Teutonic army, as well as the supported Swedish army and the West Frisian resistance army, most of whom were killed when Leeuwarden was captured, the armies of other countries have not yet used muskets on a large scale. Therefore, in this era, the English longbowmen are still the largest and most powerful long-range arms in Europe. Of course, due to the improvement of plate armor technology, the lethality of English longbowmen against knights is decreasing. However, it is extremely terrifying to use it to attack those infantrymen who have little armor. Even the famous Swiss phalanx will kneel if it encounters the English longbow corps. Even Marin's Marin phalanx will not be able to get any good when it encounters the English longbowmen. After all, whether it is the Swiss mercenaries or Marin's Spanish phalanx, only the veterans in the first 3 rows will wear breastplate armor and helmets. The soldiers in the back row basically have no armor. As long as the English longbowmen throw, it is a piece of cake to kill a large number of infantrymen in the back row. The only advantage of musketeers is that the training cost is very low. For example, the spearmen and musketeers under Marin can be pulled to the battlefield after training for a few months. Even if they are killed, they can be recruited and trained again. But the English longbowmen are different. They all started practicing archery since childhood, and they have been practicing for more than 10 years. The spines of many English longbowmen were deformed because they often drew bows during their teenage years. If a musketeer died, the worst that could happen was to recruit or capture a farmer to train for a few weeks. But if a longbowman died, the loss would be huge. Because longbowmen need more than 10 years of training before they can be trained. This is very similar to knights. The training of knights also takes more than 10 years. Therefore, if the consumption is determined, the loss of longbowmen cannot be compensated. This is also an important reason why England finally decided to abolish the longbow class. England abolished the longbow system around 1596, which was in the late period of Elizabeth I. At that time, with the religious wars and the Spanish phalanx, muskets had gradually become the mainstream of European armies. Bows and arrows slowly withdrew from the stage of history. In addition to the high training costs and the inability to afford losses, the plate armor was made more and more difficult for longbowmen to shoot through, which was also one of the important reasons for the elimination of longbowmen. Although, at a very close distance, a longbow can still shoot through plate armor with a burst. However, on the battlefield, where is the opportunity for longbowmen to leisurely aim at plate armor knights at a very close distance? When the plate armor knights get close to the longbowmen, it means that the longbowmen will be slaughtered. Therefore, longbowmen can generally only attack plate armor knights from a distance by projectiles. However, with the advancement of plate armor technology, long-range attacks are ineffective. However, muskets are different. Even if the distance is hundreds of meters, as long as the lead bullet hits, the huge impact force can still hurt the plate armor knight. In this case, countries naturally prefer muskets that restrain plate armor rather than longbows that are restrained by plate armor. Moreover, training longbowmen is too costly and time-consuming. Of course, because of the high cost of plate armor, and most of the nobles in this era are very poor. So, it is difficult for you to find an army equipped with a large number of plate armor. Speaking of which, France probably has the largest number of plate armor knights. Actually, the reason why France had so many plate armor knights was that they were afraid of being shot by the British. Later, the French plate armor became stronger and stronger, and could withstand longbows. With the use of artillery, they gradually won the 100 Years' War between England and France. Unlike at the beginning, they were basically shot into a dog by the British. Henry VII ordered the whole country to recruit soldiers, which was naturally a big commotion, and it was impossible to conceal it. The news that the 7,000 longbowmen were recruited was naturally heard by the intelligence personnel of the London branch of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce. Then, this information was quickly sent to the city of Munster. After Marin received the intelligence from the North Sea Chamber of Commerce's spies, he deduced it in his mind and found that the existence of those longbowmen was really powerful. Because those longbowmen can suppress the defenders on the top of the city with dense firepower through projectiles. Except for those soldiers wearing plate armor, other ordinary soldiers may be completely suppressed by the rain of arrows from the English longbowmen. Whoever dares to show his head will be easily injured by the rain of arrows. Although Marin supported Earl Edward with 2,000 matchlock guns, which could be used to shoot against longbowmen. However, the British army had 7,000 longbowmen, and Earl Edward could only take out 2,000 musketeers. If they were to shoot against each other, the result would definitely be that Earl Edward's musketeers, who were outnumbered, would be finished first. After all, the English longbowmen were not only numerous, but also faster than musketeers. After a musket was loaded and fired, the archers might shoot more than 3 arrows. Therefore, the only way was to let the musketeers wear plate armor. Helmets also had to wear masks, and with the cover of the city walls, they could shoot against the longbowmen. Otherwise, the 2,000 musketeers without armor would definitely be a meal for the English longbowmen. However, Earl Edward's musketeers, because of the cover of the city walls, definitely did not need armor on the lower body. Because there were battlements blocking it. But the upper body and head definitely needed tight armor to ensure that they would not be shot by arrows. Therefore, Marin planned to support Earl Edward with another 2,000 sets of half-length plate armor and equip the musketeers, so that those musketeers would have the ability to shoot against the English longbowmen and be able to protect themselves from being hurt by the English longbowmen. However, Marin could not produce 2,000 sets of half-length plate armor in a short period of time. Moreover, it should be noted that in order to hide his identity, Marin could not give Earl Edward the simple armor in the style of the East Frisian army. Otherwise, it would be exposed. Suddenly, Marin remembered the plate armor seized from the army of Charles VIII, the former king of France. Marin ambushed the army of Charles VIII and seized 7,000 sets of plate armor and 5,000 sets of horse armor. But in the end, Marin embezzled 1,000 sets of plate armor and 1,000 sets of horse armor. However, these plate armor and horse armor are all French. Now, Maximilian I has developed a more powerful Maximilian armor, and Marin also plans to replace the plate armor in the army with the more advanced Maximilian armor and eliminate the 1,000 sets of French plate armor. So Marin decided to give all the upper body armor of these 1,000 sets of French plate armor to Count Edward. As for the 1,000 sets that are still missing, Marin decided to buy a batch of second-hand plate armor, which is cheap and enough to resist arrows. In this way, Marin arranged for Kohler to buy second-hand plate armor in the Netherlands and France in the name of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce. At the same time, Marin also collected the 1,000 sets of plate armor that were originally issued in the army. Of course, those officers and heavy cavalry who handed in French plate armor can get a set of the latest Maximilian armor as compensation. Moreover, they can keep the pants of French plate armor. These people naturally wanted to exchange half a set of old French plate armor for advanced Maximilian armor. The reputation of Maximilian armor has spread to East Frisia. Because of the new convex structure, the protection of Maximilian armor is further improved, especially the protection against bows and bullets. In order to save time, Kohler instructed the North Sea Chamber of Commerce to purchase old plate armor from the homes of Dutch knights and French knights at the price of new plate armor. Such a good opportunity, many knight families will naturally not let go. In this way, Marin quickly gathered 2,000 sets of half-body plate armor, and most of them were French and Dutch-style plate armor. Even if the British saw it, they would not suspect themselves. While the British army was still gathering troops and food, Marin quickly sent the North Sea Chamber of Commerce to quietly send these 2,000 sets of half-body plate armor to Dublin by clipper and handed them over to Earl Edward. Chapter 267 Launch. After a long wait and because of the long distance back and forth, the Vatican finally responded. Julius II agreed to canonize Bishop Conrad's nephew John as an auxiliary bishop, and wrote a letter to comfort Bishop Conrad, saying that he would cover Bishop Conrad and prevent him from being impeached. However, at the same time, Julius II also wrote a letter to Marin, scolding Marin. Because the Pope's personal promotion of priests will also attract attention. This is not a very good influence. Julius II is a man who cherishes his reputation and hopes to be praised after his death, rather than everyone applauding like Alexander VI did after his death. Therefore, he warned Marin in the letter that unless it is absolutely necessary, he will never be allowed to randomly agree to such things with others. After all, the auxiliary bishop is not a cat or dog. This is a preparatory boss who is qualified to directly run for the bishop of the bishop's state. If some wealthy families are allowed to obtain it, they can almost steadily obtain the position of bishop of a bishop's state. For example, Bishop Conrad's Rietberg family, now John has become the assistant bishop. As long as he has a few more years of experience and waits for the opportunity, he can use part of the income from the land that Bishop Conrad helped Marin obtain this time to ensure that he will be elected as the bishop of a bishop state. According to the plan of the Rietberg family, they intend to let John run for the position of bishop of the Paderborn bishop state. Because the Paderborn bishop state is next to the Rietberg state. If John becomes the bishop of the Paderborn bishop state, the Rietberg state and the Paderborn bishop state will form an alliance. Once the Rietberg state is in danger, the Paderborn bishop state will definitely rescue it. At the same time, John, who will become the bishop of the Paderborn bishop state at that time, can also allow the Rietberg family to obtain a lot of benefits and privileges in the Paderborn bishop state. However, the biggest problem is that the current bishop of the Paderborn bishop state is concurrently served by Archbishop Hermann IV of Cologne. Therefore, John needs to wait until Archbishop Hermann IV of Cologne dies before he can run for election. After receiving the encouraging letter from Pope Julius II, Bishop Conrad finally made up his mind. At the end of May, Bishop Conrad convened a religious conference for the whole of Munster to discuss the handover of power with Marin. This meeting was very special. Its target was actually mainly the local abbots who owned large tracts of land. The high-level priests and priests with official positions who originally belonged to Bishop Conrad's faction had already communicated with Bishop Conrad. For those priests with official positions, their interests mainly lie in the 50,000 ugrams of interest fields. It is the abbots in the local abbeys who have the main interests of those church lands. Even those priests with official positions are very jealous of those local abbeys. In other words, the local abbeys of the Munster bishopric are more like big landowners than priests. Even the high-level officials of the Munster bishopric may not live as well as those abbeys who own a large amount of arable land. After all, the church's land, although nominally belongs to the church. However, in detail, the specific controllers of those lands are the abbeys in various places. Even the top leaders of the bishopric of Munster could only collect tithes from those monasteries. At most, the abbots who owned a large amount of arable land no longer withheld tithes, but handed them over in full. But even if the tithes were handed over in full, it would only account for 1/10 of the total harvest. The remaining 9/10 of the harvest, except for the cost and the part for feeding serfs, were all swallowed up by local monasteries. Therefore, in a country like the bishopric of Munster, the abbots who owned land were not quite the same as other priests. Even the priests favored by Bishop Conrad, who had official positions, were not as beneficial as those abbots. In order to protect their own interests, and also because of jealousy of those abbots who had benefits, Bishop Conrad and his trusted subordinates decided to unite this time to pit those abbots. The conference was held in the middle courtyard of the Munster Cathedral in the city of Munster, because the number of people attending the meeting reached more than 300, and the church hall could not fit in, so it had to be held in the courtyard of the church. Fortunately, the weather was clear and it did not rain, otherwise the participants would be unlucky. However, what surprised the abbots who came from unexpected places in Munster was that there were many low-level priests in black robes standing around the courtyard. However, what surprised the abbots was that those black-robed priests seemed unfamiliar. Moreover, on a hot day, they put on their hoods. In fact, these people were not priests at all, but soldiers arranged by Marin. It was a religious conference. If you let the soldiers make trouble at the meeting, it would be a big problem and they might be accused of blasphemy. Therefore, Marin selected a group of white-faced soldiers who looked like pampered priests, wearing black robes and holding the Bible in their hands, blocking several exits of the courtyard. At that time, even if these low-level priests made trouble, it would be an internal conflict of the church. Even if they were checked afterwards, it was basically no such person. Why? Because they were clearly fake priests. If you want to find these fake priests, you have to go to Marin's barracks. But do the abbots of the bishopric of Munster dare? Marin's army is so fierce. Sure enough, when Bishop Conrad announced that he would transfer another 80,000 ugrams of arable land in the South Munster area to Marin, it caused a strong backlash from the abbots. For a time, the venue was filled with shouting and cursing. Bishop Conrad was basically scolded like a dog. If he hadn't been accompanied by a group of guards, the abbots would probably have rushed to the stage to beat him. Bishop Conrad repeatedly told the abbots that the bishopric of Munster was no longer a church state, but a secular state. It is abnormal that secular monarchs have far less land than the church. Moreover, according to convention, when the territory is transferred, the former lord should also transfer most of the fields in the territory to the next lord. Unfortunately, the abbots just didn't listen, thinking that the church's land should not be given up an inch. As for Marin, a secular lord with little land, it's none of their business. These abbots cursed and cursed, but Bishop Conrad didn't get angry. When it was almost noon, Bishop Conrad saw that the time was almost up, so he decided to let everyone vote. As a result, Bishop Conrad and his subordinates who had profit fields naturally voted in favor. And the abbots and deputy abbots who were present all voted against it. The final result was that the abbots and deputy abbots together voted more than half, so the vote naturally failed. However, Bishop Conrad did not even raise his eyes and conducted a new round of voting, and the result was still the same. When the group of complacent abbots thought they had won and could go back to eat, something unexpected happened. Those low-level monks in black robes, who were blocking the exit boldly blocked those noble abbots back, and kept saying, priests should be pure in heart and desire, why do they need so much land? Some black-robed priests also said, greed is the original sin. According to the scene rehearsed by Marin, those low-level priests also opened the Bible and translated that sentence to the abbots. Then, he admonished the abbots, saying, as a monk, occupying so much land is definitely due to the original sin of greed. The abbots would not listen. So they wanted to push these low-level priests in black robes out to eat, and some even wanted to go to the toilet. However, these low-level priests in black robes are not real priests, but strong soldiers. Those abbots are all middle-aged and elderly people, how can they move? Then, the two sides were deadlocked. The abbots wanted to force their way in, but they were all weak middle-aged and elderly people, how could they be opponents of these young soldiers? These young soldiers were arranged in dense formations, and they kept saying, greed is the original sin, priests should be pure and abstinent, priests should not occupy all the land. They said it over and over again, just like chanting scriptures. Of course, these uneducated soldiers only knew these few sentences, and Marin forced them to recite them. The abbots were almost mad and wanted to go out, but there was no way. On the side of Bishop Conrad, the confidant who wanted to go to the toilet quietly went from the back under the cover of a large group of guards behind Bishop Conrad. Then, the sharp-eyed abbot wanted to find a way out from the door behind Bishop Conrad, but was stopped by the soldiers. Bishop Conrad told them that it was the inner holy place of Munster Cathedral and that no one could enter without special permission, moreover, that was not the exit. In this way, a large group of abbots were blocked in the yard by a group of low-level priests in black robes. They were also constantly taught by these bold, low-level priests in black robes, that greed is the original sin, priests should be thrifty. Priests should not occupy all the land. The stalemate lasted for more than 2 hours, and many abbots were already very hungry. Some abbots could hardly hold their urine. It was very embarrassing to pee in public. In the end, the abbots who were hungry were fine, but those who could hardly hold their urine chose to surrender, begged Conrad for mercy, and promised to vote in favor, and were sent to the back to use the toilet. However, when they came back from the toilet, they were not allowed to return to the abbot's queue, but had to stand beside Bishop Conrad and separate themselves from the original group. Then, Bishop Conrad organized another vote. Unexpectedly, some abbots who had just finished using the toilet changed their minds and still voted against it. Conrad noticed those people and wrote down their names with a pen and paper. Humph, this time the land transfer will be based on the monasteries of you guys who are fickle, and most of your land will be taken away, leaving you with only a certain amount of land for food. Conrad thought angrily. The vote still did not pass, and did not reach half, mainly because those fickle abbots changed their minds at the last minute. Bishop Conrad became impatient and went to eat through the back door with his confidants and the abbots who voted in favor. Those who voted against were stopped by the soldiers. After eating and drinking, Bishop Conrad entered the yard again with his confidants and the abbots who voted in favor. Many of them were still burping. The abbots were furious, but there was nothing they could do. After all, they were just weak priests, not military generals. As time went on, some abbots couldn't hold it anymore and wanted to go to the toilet, so they chose to give in. But after going to the toilet, several people chose to go back on their word. Bishop Conrad didn't say anything, but wrote down the names of the abbots who went back on their word and the names of the monasteries. While waiting for the division of land, they would mainly target them. In the end, the two sides were deadlocked until the evening. With most of the elderly abbots hungry and wanting to go to the toilet, the vote was finally passed, and it reached the absolute pass standard of more than 3/4. Chapter 268 The Pope's Order. The matter was not over yet. After the meeting, many abbots were still not satisfied. Especially, the remaining quarter of abbots who refused to vote. Although the vote failed, they did not intend to let Bishop Conrad go, and threatened to appeal. Bishop Conrad had the support of the Pope, so he was not afraid. He sneered, "Want to appeal? Sure, do you want me to provide travel expenses? Bonn or Rome? It's up to you. Of course, the Archbishop of Cologne is not qualified to revoke my position. You can only go to Rome. Do you want me to provide a carriage?" Bishop Conrad was right. Although the Archbishop of Cologne was the leader of the bishops in the northwest of Germany, he only had the right to recommend and agree who would be the bishop of the bishops, but he did not have the right to remove the bishops from the positions of the bishops. In this era, the removal of a bishop, even if he was not the bishop of the bishops, required the approval of the Pope. Even ordinary people's divorces required the approval of the Pope himself. If the power to revoke Bishop Conrad was in the hands of the Archbishop of Cologne, Bishop Conrad might be afraid. However, only the Pope in Europe had the power to revoke the position of a bishop. In this way, Bishop Conrad was not afraid at all. Because the Pope not only promoted his nephew John as an auxiliary bishop, but also wrote a letter to comfort him personally. With the support of the Pope, who is he afraid of? Therefore, facing those abbots who opposed him, Bishop Conrad was very arrogant. Even Bishop Conrad threatened that the land transferred to Marin would be divided specifically from the land owned by the quarter of the monasteries that voted against it. Although it is not known why Bishop Conrad is so arrogant, the people present are not fools. Many people speculate that Bishop Conrad's behavior should have been tacitly approved by the Pope. Otherwise, no one would be so stupid. Because if the Pope is dissatisfied with Conrad's approach, even if the bill is forcibly passed, it can be declared invalid. Bishop Conrad is obviously not stupid, otherwise he would not be able to be the bishop of two bishop states. Therefore, many abbots who have calmed down began to speculate whether someone in the Vatican supports Bishop Conrad in doing so. Otherwise, no one is willing to die like this. The quarter of the abbots who firmly opposed it felt strange, but because they couldn't get off the stage, they just held on and went to Rome to petition. Seeing the abbess leave by car, Bishop Conrad sneered and loudly ordered the Minister of Agriculture to take out the account book of the land ownership in the area where the abbess was located and began to arrange which land to be assigned to Marin. Bishop Conrad openly told the Minister of Agriculture that only enough land to feed the priests was needed for the monasteries. The rest were transferred. The other abbess present took a breath of cold air. Bishop Conrad's approach was too cruel. You know, the so-called land that is enough to feed the priests means that the food produced is enough for the priests in the monastery to eat and wear warm clothes, that's all. If this standard is used, I'm afraid that none of the rural monasteries in the Munster area needs more than 100 ugrams of land. However, in fact, because of the large amount of land in the bishopric of Munster, the cultivated land of ordinary monasteries has reached more than 1,000 ugrams. The richer ones own several thousand ugrams of arable land, which is richer than most barons. Therefore, in the bishopric of Munster, each rural monastery is equivalent to a wealthy barony. Moreover, within the jurisdiction of each monastery, the abbots only need to hand over 1/10 of the harvest. The remaining 90% is the biggest share, and the rest is divided among their subordinates. Of course, every time the abbot is replaced, that is, when the previous abbot dies, the monastery is not so arrogant at this time. Because the bishop can appoint a new abbot. At this time, the priests in the monastery will compete to curry favor with the bishop and offer a lot of benefits. But after successfully becoming the abbot, they immediately become arrogant and may not be willing to pay attention to the bishop. Therefore, the bishops thought maliciously it would be great if the abbot died every day. In that case, they would receive more bribes from the candidates for the abbot. It is precisely because most of the interests of the church land are in the hands of those rural abbots. Therefore, Bishop Conrad and his clergy officials valued the 50,000 ugrams of land so much. As for the division of the monastery's land, they didn't care much. Anyway, it was not them who suffered the loss of interests, but the clergy of the monasteries in the countryside. When the abbots of the bishopric of Munster went to Rome to appeal, hundreds of religious princes from all over Germany had already written to the Roman Catholic Church to protest against the churches giving the German religious principalities as gifts to secular princes. In the eyes of those religious princes, if this continues, they themselves will one day be given away as gifts of reward. Therefore, they were afraid of the outcome of the bishopric of Munster and the bishopric of Osnabrück being given away as gifts, fearing that they would be the next gift to be given away. For this reason, hundreds of religious princes in the German region decided to jointly protest and put pressure on the Holy See to prevent such incidents from happening again. Julius II also felt a headache after receiving the joint protest letter. After all, he had just become the Pope and had not yet secured his position. As soon as he came up, he was opposed by so many religious princes in the German region. If he did not handle it well, the prestige of the Holy See would be greatly reduced. For this reason, after thinking for many days, Julius II finally came up with a countermeasure. He issued a papal decree targeting all religious princes in the German region. In the decree, Julius II took the lead and accused the religious princes in the German region of being somewhat hypocritical to the Holy See. For example, on the issue of tithes, the various princes began to find excuses of one kind or another and began to default on and underpay tithes. In short, they tried their best to find ways to deduct the tithes and were unwilling to pay them in full to the Holy See. Therefore, this time, the two religious princes of the bishopric of Munster and the bishopric of Osnabrück were given to Marin as gifts. In addition to thanking him for his outstanding contributions to the Holy See, punishing the bishopric of Munster and the bishopric of Osnabrück was also an important reason. Because, in recent years, the tithes paid by the bishopric of Munster and the bishopric of Osnabrück to the Holy See have been reduced from half to about 30%. Therefore, these two countries have become the targets of the Holy See. In fact, the tithes paid by the bishopric of Munster and the bishopric of Osnabrück to the Holy See in recent years are indeed only 30%. The reason is that the bishopric of Munster and the archbishopric of Cologne have joined forces to deduct about 20% of the tithes for various reasons. Among them, the Archbishop of Cologne took the largest share, and Bishop Conrad only took a small share. Moreover, the Archbishop of Cologne was also the leader. However, when Julius II accused, he did not blame the Archbishop of Cologne, nor did he specifically blame Bishop Conrad, but blamed the two bishoprics of the bishopric of Munster and the bishopric of Osnabrück, and interpreted the act of giving the two countries to Marin as a kind of punishment. Moreover, in the decree, Julius II also threatened that if any religious princely state was found to have tax evasion, the fate of the bishopric of Munster and the bishopric of Osnabrück would be an example. Of course, as a seasoned politician, Julius II naturally knew how to hit with one blow and then give two more. At the end of the decree, Julius II also announced that the bishops of each bishopric would be allowed to collect 1/10 of the harvest from the church land of the subordinate monasteries as a subsidy for the daily expenses of each bishopric. This policy benefited the bishops of the various bishop states, while the ones whose interests were harmed were the abbots at the bottom. However, Julius II did not care about the opinions of the abbots. Because, after all, those abbots were just local rich people in the countryside. They had no army and no say in national affairs. They were just a group of small priests with very practical benefits. Even if they opposed the Holy See, they would not make a sound. Unlike those bishops who held military power and had a say in the European situation, their voices would be listened to. Sure enough, after this papal decree was made public in the German region, the bishops were very dissatisfied with the threatening tone of Julius II. However, the two dates given at the end really made them like it too much. From the hands of those independent abbots under their command, legally obtaining 10% of the profits, the total is definitely a huge profit. Stimulated by this huge profit, the bishops in the German region could only cheer. Moreover, Julius II also promised in the decree that as long as those bishops stopped tax evasion, they would no longer be at risk of being sent out by the Holy See. Although they could no longer find ways to manipulate the tithes, Julius II allowed them to legally blackmail the abbots below, which would allow the bishops to get enough compensation. Even far more than before. Therefore, the bishops praised the wisdom of His Majesty the Pope. As for the abbots whose interests were damaged, dared to speak ill of the Pope. Who dared to say it? It happened that the bishop could say that you were blasphemous, and then take the opportunity to dismiss the disobedient abbot and replace him with his own people. At the very least, you can also take advantage of the opportunity to re-elect the abbot and collect bribes from the candidates. In this way, Julius II quickly consolidated his reputation in the German region by damaging the interests of the lower-level abbots who had no say to please the bishops. For a time, Julius II became the most popular pope among German bishops, including bishops in other regions. Moreover, because of the fear of being punished as an example, the tithes of the German bishoprics will probably not be in arrears or seek exemptions. Because, with the two unfortunate examples of the bishopric of Munster and the bishopric of Osnabrück, no one wants to lose power easily. Chapter 269 Sharma. In fact, along with the papal bull, there was also a licensing decree. This licensing decree was Julius II's approval of Marin's previous request to fix the tithe to £90 per acre, equivalent to £15 per acre, in the areas controlled by Marin, such as East Frisia. At the same time, Julius II also agreed to Marin's proposal to temporarily divide the bishopric of Munster into north and south. The South Munster region will collect tithes according to the old standard until Bishop Conrad dies and Marin takes over the South Munster region. In the North Munster region, starting from the autumn harvest next year, it will begin to collect tithes at a fixed standard of £90 per acre. In fact, it is very disadvantageous for ordinary fields to be collected according to this standard. Because more than half of the cultivated land in Europe does not meet the standard of £150 per acre. However, Julius II lived in the East Frisian county for a long time and knew that Marin had mastered the mysterious fertilizer technology that could increase grain production several times. And most of his son-in-law's large amount of money came from this. It can even be said that the position of Pope was also bought by his son-in-law. Marin asked for a fixed tithe rate, and Julius II knew very well that this was an attempt to circumvent the real tithe and legally evade taxes. However, as his father-in-law, he must help. Moreover, from the outside, Marin did not do badly, and gave a high standard of £90 per acre. Even if the secret of Marin's doubling of agricultural output is discovered one day, it doesn't matter. At most, he can shirk his responsibilities by saying that he didn't know that Marin had mastered new agricultural technology. As for the fixed tax rate, it is a reward for Marin's contribution. If it is given, it will not be cancelled. Otherwise, it seems that the Holy See is untrustworthy. With the Pope's permission decree, Marin can be considered relieved. Because in the future, he can legally evade taxes, and no one can say that he is wrong. As for the abbots who went to Rome to complain, Julius II directly took out the method of the staff of the letter visiting in later generations, persuading them with kind words, but just not accepting the complaints. In the end, Julius II even acted as a mediator, with a face of the kind old uncle next door, persuading the abbots not to fall out with their superiors. These abbots who complained were fooled by the amiable Julius II, and were sent on the carriage back to Germany before they understood what was going on. After getting on the carriage, they woke up. Rome came in vain this time. Then, they also realized that the Pope supported Bishop Conrad, and their efforts were meaningless. However, what they didn't expect was that after they went to Rome, Bishop Conrad had already taken a ruthless approach to the land of their monasteries. The abbots who went to Rome to complain, the land of their monasteries was divided by Bishop Conrad, most of the arable land, leaving only a small part of the land that was enough for the teachers in the monastery to eat, drink, defecate and urinate. In the future, the teachers of these monasteries will have a hard time, and they will not be as carefree as before. In London, England, many employees of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce branch are spies sent by Marin. In the name of doing business, relying on a Frisian language that is very close to English, they can easily blend into the British people and find out all kinds of information. Because of the war against Ireland, the whole of England is now mobilized. Every day, each county will send a carriage to transport all kinds of materials into the city of London and hand them over to the royal family for use by the army. The staff of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, on the streets of London, silently watched the actions of the British, and at the same time, secretly recorded everything and wrote it all in the report. On this day, Kane and Robbie, employees of the North Sea Chamber of Commerce, were sitting on a table outside a pub in London and drinking low-quality beer. Suddenly, there was a tremor in the ground. Kane and Robbie looked up and saw a four-wheeled carriage coming into view. The two of them suddenly opened their mouths. "Oh my God, what is this?" Kane was shocked. As for Robbie, he was not much better. After seeing the carriage, he was so scared that his beer cup almost fell to the ground. What kind of monster is this? Why is it so huge? At this time, a local British businessman at the next table laughed. "Ha, young man, are you stunned? This is not a monster, but a specialty of our Lincolnshire, the English horse." English horse? It's really big. This shoulder height is 2 meters. Kane murmured. Because Marin promoted the new measurement in East Frisia, as employees and spies of the cultural North Sea Chamber of Commerce, Kane and Robbie obviously knew the new measurement and often used it. Meter? Obviously, meter is a new word that the British have not heard of. Therefore, the British businessman from Lincolnshire did not understand what 2 meters, meter, meant. Kane quickly reacted and explained, it's about 6.56 feet. Oh, you should have said it earlier. If you had used human standards earlier, I wouldn't have understood it. The British businessman from Lincolnshire said carelessly. By the way, what is the origin of this English horse? Why is it so huge? If the knights ride on it, wouldn't it be so majestic? Kane pretended to be a novice and began to ask questions. However, what he said was really consistent with his thoughts. In Kane's opinion, such a majestic horse must have a high load capacity. It must be easy to carry a knight wearing a set of plate armor. If East Frisia is introduced, then Marin will definitely reward him and Robbie. Huh, kid, you don't have any knowledge. Kane was stunned. Isn't what he said wrong? Such a big and strong horse is very suitable for carrying knights. Just now he saw that the English horse easily pulled a huge four-wheeled carriage full of goods. Under normal circumstances, it takes 2 horses to pull it. Boy, if you buy me a drink, I will tell you why this horse is not suitable for being a war horse for knights. The British businessman said proudly. Kane and Robbie were eager to know the detailed information of this giant horse, so they naturally would not be stingy. So, the two of them offered the Lincolnshire businessman a large glass of draft beer that had not yet gone bad. After a glass of draft beer, the British businessman from Lincolnshire started talking. This kind of horse, although it is huge and powerful, but because of its huge size, the whole horse looks a bit clumsy. So, although this kind of horse is big and powerful, it is not fast when running. The knight's warhorse requires not only strength, but also a fast speed. For charging, speed is naturally required. This kind of horse has strength but lacks speed, so it is not suitable to be a warhorse. However, it is definitely a good hand for pulling a cart. Therefore, this kind of horse is the best draft horse, but not very suitable to be a warhorse. So, is this kind of horse generally of this height? Robbie asked cautiously. Of course, in our Lincolnshire, there are many horses of this height. Although they knew that this kind of horse was not suitable to be a warhorse, Kane and Robbie still wrote the information about this heavy horse in the report and sent it back to East Frisia. Then, it was sent to Munster City in the British intelligence. Marin did not leave during this period, but continued to stay in Munster with his army to supervise the division and transfer of land. However, he also kept an eye on the war situation in Britain and read the intelligence sent from England every day. Coincidentally, he saw Kane and Robbie's report that day. English horses' shoulder height generally reaches about 2 meters. Oh, isn't this a Shire horse? Marin suddenly remembered that this was the famous Shire horse in later generations. Once, Marin planned to introduce Shire horses to pull heavy artillery. However, because he was busy with other things, he forgot about it. It happened that Kane and Robbie's intelligence was sent over, and he remembered that he really needed to introduce this heavy horse to transport heavy artillery. Shire horses have no other advantages, but they are strong. According to the information of later generations, this kind of horse can pull 5 tons of beer alone. Of course, that was on the road in later generations. If it is on a dirt road with greater resistance, it can probably only pull 2 or 3 tons of cargo. But it doesn't matter. The heavy artillery in Marin's army, even the heavy naval guns, weigh only 2 tons. It is perfect to use Shire horses to pull heavy artillery. So Marin immediately issued an order. Kane and Robbie were to buy strong and tall uncastrated English horses and introduce them to East Frisia for breeding and cultivation. In addition, Kane and Robbie were rewarded with 500 gold coins each for their meritorious service in discovering this good horse. Chapter 270 Little Columbus. Marin continued to spend time in Munster, but he did not forget to remotely control his homeland and the Duchy of Schleswig. Especially in the Duchy of Schleswig, Marin often communicated with the Prime Minister of the Palace of the Duchy of Schleswig, Mikkel, and the military commander, Wolf Esprand, to understand the situation there. However, what surprised Marin was that his main force had gone south to Munster, so why did the other side not take this opportunity to attack the Duchy of Schleswig? These days, there was no movement on the Danish border, which made Marin feel a little abnormal. In fact, King Hans of Denmark had no confidence in his more than 10,000 troops. At the beginning, he had seen the combat effectiveness of Marin's army. After the fall of Copenhagen, the 7,000 defenders and many strong men in the city were beaten by Marin's army and retreated step by step. Therefore, King Hans no longer believed in the combat effectiveness of his own army. In order to fight against Marin's army, King Hans chose to hire the most famous and powerful Swiss mercenaries in Europe to help him fight. At the same time, he also helped train his own army. King Hans believed that by the next spring, the 20,000 new Danish troops would be trained and could completely fight against Marin and defeat him. Marin didn't know what Hans was thinking, but he still strengthened the intelligence reconnaissance on the border between the Duchy of Schleswig and Denmark. In the border area, a situation that made Marin laugh and cry was that on the Jutland Peninsula, a large number of Danish families whose daughters were robbed by Marin's soldiers secretly crossed the border and asked to live in the Duchy of Schleswig. It turned out that after the defeat, King Hans of Denmark planned to sleep on straw and taste gall to compete with Marin. But it takes a lot of money to support the army to compete with Marin. Therefore, King Hans of Denmark intensified the exploitation and oppression of domestic serfs. Some people whose daughters were robbed because of oppression suddenly remembered that when Marin's men robbed those Danish girls, they ordered the officers to issue an invoice to those families and promised that if they didn't live well in the future, they could come to the Duchy of Schleswig for help. Some people couldn't make it, so they secretly crossed the border and came to the Duchy of Schleswig to seek help with the mentality of giving it a try. After hearing about it, Mikkel, the palace minister, immediately looked for the 10,000 garrison soldiers in the country based on their invoices, found the person written on the invoice, and informed them that your father-in-law, or brother-in-law, is here, come and entertain them. As for those daughters who married to East Frisia, Mikkel temporarily settled them, but helped write letters and sent them to the mainland to find their relatives. According to Marin's previous instructions, these people are considered to be his family members and must not be neglected. If you want, you can be settled in the manor as a serf. Of course, the serfs in the Duchy of Schleswig are completely different from the Danish serfs. Since the use of fertilizers last year, the grain production in the manor of the Duchy of Schleswig has also skyrocketed. After these old people were sent to some invalids' manors specially set up for disabled soldiers and their families, they only needed to do some work within their ability, such as feeding pigs and sheep, etc., and they could still have a life of bread every day, and they were full. The border between the Duchy of Schleswig and Denmark is only tightly guarded on the Duchy of Schleswig. There are not many garrisons on the Danish side. Some people who have a good life in the invalids' manor naturally have to go back to pick up their families. Moreover, they have to tell their fellow villagers about this good news. So, next, a father-in-law and mother-in-law smuggling fever formed on the border between the Duchy of Schleswig and Denmark. A large number of father-in-laws of the soldiers in the Marin army chose to smuggle over because they couldn't survive and live in the invalids' manor. The work was not hard, but they could eat enough. Of course, Mikkel welcomes those fathers-in-law and mother-in-law with their children the most. After all, they are young laborers. As long as the son-in-law is in the 10,000 troops of the Duchy of Schleswig, those families can be arranged to live in the invalids' manor immediately. As for those whose sons-in-law are in East Frisia, they need to wait for a response from there before they can be arranged to live in the less invalids' manor. However, after being arranged to live in the less invalids' manor, Mikkel will not let them starve to death. Every day, there will be a supply of kohler bread mixed with straw chaff. For these people, the treatment is good enough. You know, in Denmark, they were exploited by the crazy Danish King Hans, and they may not even have bread to eat. Hearing about this father-in-law and mother-in-law smuggling fever, Marin laughed for a long time. Then he also notified the group of veterans who came to Munster with him that if they married a Danish wife, they should be prepared to check the information at any time and place their father-in-law and mother-in-law in the less invalids' manor as soon as possible so that they can live a stable life. The less invalids' manor is not just as simple as having enough food. If people in the manor are sick, the official will reimburse the medical expenses, and will arrange for the disciples of Morigen and Bartel to help the disabled soldiers and the families of the less invalids in the manor to see a doctor for free. Therefore, entering the less invalids' manor is equivalent to entering a nursing home. Of course, unlike the nursing home, people in the manor need to do some work within their ability. Just after telling the veterans about their father-in-law and mother-in-law's smuggling, the guard came to report that Mr. Columbus Jr. was here. Who is Columbus Jr.? Of course, it is Diego Columbus, Columbus's eldest son. At the beginning of the year, Diego Columbus, recommended by his father, took the piece of cotton cloth found by Columbus and participated in the voyage to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico as an adjutant to find cotton seeds. This voyage is very simple, just follow the coordinate map drawn by Columbus to find it. Moreover, the team was led by several old assistants of Columbus, who were very experienced and would never make mistakes. In this way, the fleet arrived at the Yucatan Peninsula west of Cuba smoothly. Diego Columbus, who was eager to make a contribution, landed with a large number of glass products and began to trade with the local natives. With the help of his father's assistant who knew Indian language, Diego had a friendly exchange with the local Indians. Under the temptation of beautiful glass products, the ignorant Indians decisively took out cotton seeds and exchanged them with Diego. Because it was a crop grown artificially, cotton seeds were abundant. Diego exchanged a whole sack of cotton seeds and happily moved them back to the ship. However, Diego was unwilling to make such a small contribution, and went to exchange for other things. Then, he exchanged for several bags of corn and a bag of sisal seeds. He even exchanged for some cocoa beans and cocoa seeds. In order to please Marin, Diego asked people to use saltpeter to make ice and freeze the cocoa beans all the way, intending to bring them back for Marin to taste. When Diego brought the cocoa beans to Marin, Marin recognized them at a glance: cocoa pods. In fact, cocoa is the pronunciation of the Indians, which is transliterated. Marin's pronunciation is of course similar to that of the Indians. Little Columbus Diego was shocked, because this thing has never appeared in Europe. How did Marin know? After a short moment of daze, Diego immediately flattered Marin and said that Marin had a sharp eye. Marin ignored him and smashed the shell of the cocoa pod, picked it up and tasted it, and found that it really tasted like chocolate. If it is promoted and made into chocolate, it would be good. However, this plant can only be grown in the tropics and is not suitable for growing in Europe. But in the final analysis, this kind of food is dispensable. What Marin cares most about is cotton. Diego quickly took out the sack of cotton seeds. Marin grabbed it and took a look. Sure enough, it was exactly the same as the cotton seeds he had seen in his previous life. Then, Diego took out sisal seeds and corn. Marin had complicated feelings about corn. Of course, he knew the benefits of corn. In modern times, corn is one of the 3 major staple foods in the world. However, Marin did not plan to introduce corn to Europe now. Why? He was afraid that corn would impact his grain market. Similarly, Marin would never allow potatoes to be introduced to Europe. Otherwise, his wheat would not be sold. So, Marin resolutely ordered people to destroy all the corn. As for sisal, Marin did not know this seed. But after Diego's explanation and learning about the appearance of sisal, Marin suddenly realized that it was sisal. Then, Marin was overjoyed. You know, sisal is a very good material for sailing cables in later generations. Sisal fibers are elastic, tensile, and corrosion resistant, and can be soaked in seawater for a long time. At the same time, they are also very resistant to friction. Therefore, in later generations, sisal was widely used in the manufacture of warship cables, conveyor belts for machines, and fishing nets for marine fishing. Of course, it can also be used to make sacks and weave rainproof cloth. It can also be used to weave canvas. The canvas woven with sisal is very strong and rarely needs to replace the sails. Therefore, sisal is a crop that is extremely beneficial to great voyages. It could even be considered a treasure. Diego had discovered this treasure, so he was naturally rewarded. In addition, he had successfully obtained a large number of cotton seeds, so Marin waved his hand and directly rewarded Diego with 10,000 gold coins. Then, he promoted him to Deputy Chief of Guards and Captain of the Naval Fleet, which was like a layer of gold for the resume of Comrade Columbus.